Come with me, beyond the Iridian Empire, or Dorn Valon, or even the Khotan Empire or the Hosiag Wildlands, beyond any of the lands of Druisance, beyond even time. For there is a place that houses the stories of every soul. This is not an archive of monarchs and emperors, though their names do grace many spines. These hallowed halls entertain every sorrow, every longing, every whim, every breath of every living thing. Within this place, a librarian dwells. They are not a curator or a being of judgment for the afterlife. No, they are simply the keeper of all stories. From time to time, the librarian will pluck a book from the shelf and learn of life. For this is the Library of Lives Spent. Even hundreds of feet above the crashing waves of the icy Osterlige Gulf, cool spray wet the stone relief that decorated the gates to the Exeran Tower. These were not fortified walls to keep out the slimy, black-eyed creatures that could crawl from the swamps in High Celadon. The Exeran Tower not only housed the most deadly and powerful magic users in all of Dorn Valon, but hundreds of students keen to show their mettle. The Exeran Tower needed no fortification. No, this was a boundary of iron fencing, punctuated with long walls of pale, creamy stone, and adorned with intricate reliefs depicting moments of pride and peril that the tower and its inhabitants had lived through over the centuries. The young man walked up to the south gates and drifted along the story-made stone. His weather-reddened hand reached out to feel the smooth curves of it. A ferocious dragon breathed its searingly toxic breath onto the terrified people running from doors and jumping from windows. The land turned to putrescence, and the remaining people were enslaved in the occupation of the dragon. Everyone who knew the story of the Second Dragon War, which was everyone, knew how the tower had been conquered and held by a beast larger than a 5-story house. Everyone knew the story of how a group of heroes known as the Wanderers came and fought the dragon. The clever beast had used the ancient artifacts housed in the tower to extinguish magic, and yet they ran in without fear or hesitation, and with one of Dorn Valon's greatest leaders, Mithild Doro, they fought the dragon and brought the dragon down and saved all those still held within. Dempsey regarded the final relief in the series, the lineup of heroes shaking hands with Doro, and so quickly readying themselves for the next battle in the war. His face remained impassive, like a mask, but the wind whipped the quiet words from his mouth and flew them out to sea. Insufferable. A man wrapped in layers and layers of knitted scarves and a waterproof hat offering little protection from the coastal misting grimaced at Dempsey. "Good afternoon. What business have you with the Exeran Tower today?" "Hello, I'm here to see Mithild Doro." The man raised his eyebrows, but picked up his large leather ledger. "Right-o. Well, thought the High Master was away, but I'm often wrong. Name and time of appointment?" "Oh, I don't have an appointment, but..." "Right. No, I'm sorry, Lord Doro doesn't take meetings of this nature, what with running this place and being a High Collier member." That old familiar hand gripped him. Temper, like the poisoned dragon's breath, wrapping him in vexation. "What is that nature?" he snapped. "This nature you speak of, the nature of the meeting I am to have with him. Tell me." The man's eyebrows dropped, but Dempsey did not look away. while he reached into his mind for all the backup names he could think of that might help him with this ignorant lackey. I'm quite sure I don't know your business, but no, you don't know. If Doro is not here to receive me, I'm sure Mistress Lightlow, High Seclin, I believe, would be glad to speak to the only son of Arthez Gadael. Look that one up in your book. Now open the gate and let me to my day. Lady Lightlow is also not available for spontaneous meetings. Ask her, please. Pardon me? I think you heard. Ask her if she would like to see me. My mother fought for this land and knew both Lady Lightlow and Lord Doro very well. And I'm here on important business. They will not be happy to hear that I was diddled about by some damp fool manning the gates. While the man set about speaking in hushed tones to a milky white crystal that gave off a slight glow, Dempsey turned away and lifted his head to the sun, now beginning its descent into a watery horizon. He felt the waves of light spray coat his already drenched face and the cool drips through his hair. This was not the start that he'd hoped for, but it was nothing. No doubt he would be sipping tea in a warm parlour in no time, and he would crack a joke with Lady Lightlow about how he was nearly turned away by some silly little Jobsworth at the South Gates. Imagine! After half an hour's awkward wait, trying not to catch the eye of the man, he was finally let in. He smiled as he walked by the tiny stone cubby built into the gates where the man had to sit all day. Dempsey had been taught to always be kind to everybody, even if they had not been kind to him. So he pulled his mouth into a shape of grace and forgiveness as he headed away. The tower had been described in books and songs as a pillar to the heavens, and the description rang true. A central tower, long and lean and pale, disappeared into the sky, and Dempsey couldn't see the top of it with his naked eye. The main tower was surrounded by 4 smaller towers in the cardinal directions. Though smaller, these buildings had to be hundreds of floors tall. Buzzing around the towers were the students of the school, riding the famed collection of broomsticks that helped inhabitants navigate the towers. His stomach flipped, thinking about how for the next few years of his life, flying to class on the back of a broom would be as normal as putting milk in his coffee each morning. A sour-faced dwarven woman greeted him at the grand entrance. No doubt she'd had the other end of the white crystal, because she gave him a thin-lipped, "Come this way, please," before leading him to a dark stone anteroom, and explaining that Lady Lightlow was very busy, but would try and see him when she could. And so he was left in this windowless room, lit by a few candle sconces on the walls. Dempsey removed his hooded cloak and shook the water from it as much as he could, and draped it carefully on the back of the chair. Though the temperature in the room did not warrant it, he also took his blue knitted waistcoat off and put that on the back of another chair. If it were not uncouth, he would have removed his boots as well, as they squelched when he walked. He pulled an embroidered handkerchief from his pocket and ruffled his hair with it. He wanted to make a good first impression if he could, and so he set about making himself look as much like his mother as he could, keeping his warm, sandy blonde hair loose, carefully letting those curls fall without obscuring his pointed ears. He wiped the road dirt from his face and bit at his lips to redden them. For the next 2 hours, Dempsey fussed at himself and checked and rechecked the state of his cloak and put his now mostly dry waistcoat back on. He thought of how he would quickly befriend Lady Lightlow. Despite her importance at the school and future authority over him, when he becomes a student, they would laugh together like old chums before no time. He imagined how they would reminisce and share thoughts on mutual friends. She would probably have to be honest with him and say something like, "Oh, Dempsey, we shall have to pretend to be very professional together when you're a student here." And he would, of course, be completely respectful of her position, and only occasionally smile at her with the familiarity of an old family friend. Maybe on days when he might intuit that she'd had a hard day, he would be a perfect student. And perhaps in time, a shoulder for her to lean on. Doro too, perhaps. These people, after all, had the weight of all Dawn Valon on their shoulders. Finally, he heard tapping of feet on stone approaching his room. "Hello!" The voice came before the door had even opened. Her accent was broadly High Caledon, and when she stepped in, he saw that she was smaller than he'd imagined, probably just shy of 3 feet. Her dress was a jolly red velvet, with yellow piping, and heavy enough to swoosh as she walked. Her chestnut hair was pulled into a neat, tidy bun, and her eyes danced. "So sorry to keep you waiting. I lecture most afternoons, and today was Advanced Illusions with the third years, which is my very favourite. So you find me in good spirits." "Mr. Gadael, and I am so honoured to meet you. Won't you follow me, and we can get you something warm and spicy to take the edge off while we chat." Dempsey launched to his feet and thrust out his hand to shake, but she'd already turned to sweep away up a set of stone stairs. Grabbing his cloak and bag, he ran after her. The room was, as he imagined the interior of this place to be. Arched windows looking out over the north side of the school to the rolling hills of the coast, all cliffs and heather and grass. Armchairs of wood and brocade cushions. On the walls to one side was a painting of the final royal family before the fall, the Valstinas, all white-haired elves. On the other wall was a portrait of the current High Council. It was the official group portrait that was easy to find and only re-released when a new member was ushered in. Already on a low oval table in the middle of the room was a tray, a pot with warm vapour drifting from the spout, and 2 matching cups in saucers with daisy prints on them. "I got the kind with dandelion root, rose hips, and a wee bit of horseradish for cake. Would you like a spoon of honey in yours?" "Very much so, thank you, Lady Lightlow." He imagined she would wave off the formal use of her name, but instead she smiled and handed him some tea and hopped up into a chair. "So, your mother was Arthes Gadael. I was so sorry to hear that she died, Mr. Gadael. I only met her a few times, but she seemed quite a woman and an excellent innate mage as far as I hear." "Thank you. It means so much to hear of her spoken fondly, especially by people like yourself, Lady Lightlow, who made so many great people." "Oh, bless you. And how do you fare in her absence, do you mind me asking?" "It has been hard, I don't mind admitting. But it is my hardships that have brought me here to speak to you, actually." She nestled back in her chair and nurtured a careful sip from the hot tea and indicated with her eyebrows that he should continue. "You see, my mother, as you said, she was powerful, but she was always self-taught, and she wanted me to receive a formal education." Lightlow nodded approvingly without pulling the cup from her lips. "She always told me I would sit your exam and gain entry into these hallowed halls, rather than, as she did, learn in the dangerous cut and thrust of life on the road. So when she died last month, I knew I had to fulfill her wishes and come here." "Oh, that's wonderful news, Mr. Gadael. Please call me Dempsey." "Dempsey. So, our exams are Evadne for the next year. You can be marked down for early for next year if you like. I will mark it for my own invigilation, actually. I'd be delighted to."
"Evadne? But that's only last month. Could I not sit them now for the new year?"
Dempsey already knew he'd struggle in the months before the new year, but he'd find a way to keep a roof over his head for 2.5 months if he had to. "I'm sorry, Dempsey. We don't make exceptions for student applications."
"Maybe if you spoke to Lord Doro."
"We would love to see you in the new year, though. I imagine you'll be even more ready then. You can pick up so much in a year. Never underestimate life experience."
Dempsey pushed down that hand that reached up to around his ribcage and banished the sharp, panicked thoughts from his mind. Indeed, the problem is, he wouldn't look like a sad little homeless orphan in front of her. He pushed a smile out, but he sensed it did not look natural. I sold the homestead to get here. Mother always spoke of Mythil Doro and the Exeter Tower with such warmth and respect. I was sure you'd make an exception and let me in before the end of the academic year." She was already shaking her head, but Dempsey had to keep going before she cut him off. "Please, Mistress, Lady Lightlow, just give me the test now. I think with my potential you'll be glad you did. Look." He started pulling his books from his bag. She put her cup and saucer down, but Dempsey put his hand up to stay her a while so he could just show her something. But when he pulled his spellbook from his bag, he found that the rain had got in and the pages were damp. Pulling open the sheets, he had to stifle a groan as every inked spell, so carefully laid out, was now smudged and blurred. Lady Lightlow looked at the pages and gave him a pitiful look. "No, wait, I can still cast with this." "Why is your spellbook not with the official waterproof ink and toughened paper, Dempsey? And really, you should have most of it memorised." "Because I didn't know. His voice was rising now. He couldn't help it, that hand of rage had him by the throat. "Mother never had a spellbook. She just seemed to draw the spells in the air with her fingertips, but she never showed me how." "And you don't seem to have inherited her innate powers?" "Wait, yes, maybe." Dempsey was standing now. His fingers trembled as he raised them in attempt some theatricality as he clapped them together. Focusing all his might on them, he turned his palms so that his fingertips touched his wrists, and they lay horizontal. He pushed them together so tight and willed the spark between them. He shut his eyes and imagined a bright, beautiful peach flame. And suddenly, he pulled his hands apart. But instead of revealing a bright flame, there was only a few gentle sparks, and then nothing. "Mr. Gadael, I'm so sorry. I promise I will see you next year. It's clear to me that you're in much need of the year to develop your skills." No. I'm coming here to develop my skills, and please, it's Dempsey." She slid from her chair and straightened her skirts. "Wait, no, I'm not done. I've not done it yet." "Please don't attempt to cast from that spellbook. It's quite dangerous, actually." "No, I know I have this one. Please, I should have done this before. Here." He forcefully and slowly ran his fingers through his long hair. He thought of home, the cottage, flint walls, roses in the garden and a weeping willow by the pond. He thought of his mother embracing him for the last time, wrapping her slender elven arms around his neck and saying, "This is what I do, my dearest little wren. I'll be back before you know it with gold enough to fix the house and start your school fund." Dempsey could not remember what he'd said in return, but she smiled at him, straightened his collar, and walked away. When the memory of the last time he'd ever seen his mother faded, he sent the memory like a mote of light to the nape of his neck. And when his hands touched the spot, his fingers felt for the string. He'd only done this a few times before, but to his relief, he found the tiny edge of magic poking through his scalp. He pulled a few strands of hair with it when he yanked it through from his head and dangled it in front of Isabel Lightlow like an eel. She exhaled slowly. "You must know that I do not accept the thoughts of others. This is highly manipulative, Mr. Gadael. I'm sorry, but I cannot accept this. It could be anything." "Please, my lady, please." He took one knee before her. "This, at the very least, proves that I have some aptitude in the arcane arts. You knew my mother. I would not give you a nasty memory. I'm desperate, Lady Lightlow. Is that what you want to hear? I have only the 300 gold pieces from selling the house to my name. The only thing I want to do, the only thing I can do with my wretched life now is become the finest student you have ever had." His voice was a whisper now, pushed through a tight throat. "I'll make you so proud, Lady Lightlow. I'll make you so proud." She looked at him now, in the way that made his guts roil. Pity. Pure pity. Like he was a horse with a broken leg. After the span of a few lifetimes, or heartbeats, Dempsey knew not which, she took the thread of memory in her thumb and forefinger. She pulled at the other end as well, testing its strength and inspecting the strand. Then she opened her 2 sets of digits, stretching it into a thin veneer. Her way with magic was so gentle and effortless, and she handled his memory with respect. She lifted her 2 hands above her head, and as if tying a silk scarf, she brought the memory down on her hair. She looked straight ahead, and her eyes glistened, and when the memory faded, she looked at her hands for a few moments. Mr. Gadael, a few things occur to me about your situation, and I hope I can be frank with you. He nodded. Good. Firstly, whoever gave you 300 for that house has ripped you off, and I'm very sorry for it. You should have gotten at least 5,000, even if it had dilapidations. Secondly, even 5,000 would not pay for your tuition here, I'm afraid. The fees are very steep, and scholarships are hard to come by, and only awarded on examination day in Evadne, which you have missed. Thirdly, and most regrettably, Mr. Gadael, you are yet to show me the kind of aptitude that we need for entrance into this school. I don't say this to be cruel, but we only have 50 students a year in fine arcana, and they would be expected to be of a higher standard. Please, take the money that you have, rent some rooms, and spend a year working out who you are, Mr. Gadael. Get out there and help some people. Come back in 8 months and tell me some incredible tales about what you did and how you helped people, and how you developed your skills. I didn't know your mother very well, but you should know there's no shame in not inheriting her abilities. You'll have your own path to tread. He couldn't hear it any longer. He could not endure her clawing, condescending words any more. She was not going to budge, and that was all he needed to know. He was not hers to give advice to. He did not need uppity little wizards patronising him and giving him nothing. He snatched up his bag and cloak, still heavy with damp, but before he reached the door, he turned back. He could say one more thing before the tears came, and he would. My mother fought in the war. She didn't just fight dragons, but ogres and half-dragons. And before the war, she fought banshees and ghouls and saved villages from savage gnolls and towns from werewolves. When it was discovered that Laor had a psychic sea creature beneath it, keeping its inhabitants in a trance, it was my mother that volunteered to go down into the tunnels and kill it. When the library in Odon was infested with awakened books that attacked anyone who came near it, she rushed in and helped. People sing songs of her heroics, but she didn't do it for that. She did it to help people, to keep Dawn Valon safe. She died fighting before she could pass her knowledge on to me, but that isn't enough for you, is it? It seems it's not enough to die for this country. She might not have been one of your bloody precious wanderers that everyone seems to kiss the arses of, but she saved just as many lives. You can keep your precious wanderers. My mother was worth 10 of them. She looked at him now, less like a broken horse, and more like one so crazed by a storm that it bucks and rears and gallops straight into the ocean. I promise you now, before all the gods, that you will be sorry you cast me out today. And before she could reply, he turned and ran, taking the stairs 2 by 2 and pushing his way out and into the winter air again. He ran past the wretched gateman and did not stop running till he was back in Elenthyr. By the time Hyafir entered the fairy fop, it was packed with people hunched over plates of what looked like thick slices of beef with roast potatoes. The vegetable was harder to identify, but possibly boiled swede. She found Dempsey in the far corner, ordering another pitcher of ale from an unimpressed Jess. She touched the barmaid on the shoulder, requested a second mug for that order, and hugged her friend tightly before settling in. He seemed different since she'd seen him in the spring. More grown up, perhaps, or less, it was hard to tell. But she followed through on her instinct to keep one hand on him at all times, like a mare prone to bolting.
So, how did it go? I was praying to see you somehow. Been given a tour or the like.
No tour.
But you are in, are you not? The candle on the table lit his tangled mop of brassy blonde hair and kept his face in a little shadow.
I'm in. She didn't need to see the triumphant smirk to know that it was there. She pulled him close again.
I knew it. So when do you start? Oh, this is great. I wonder how you'll catch up or if you'll just get ahead for the next academic year. Dempsey, this is wonderful. Just as we always said, racing each other to the top. He was looking at her now, warm hazel eyes catching on her spellbook, strapped to her side, the symbols stitched carefully into the lining of her buttercup cloak, the bronze ring of objects that every student carries. Key to your room, gem to the library access, iron symbol of Exerin. They jangled from her belt loop and caught in her skirts.
I have to entertain myself before the next year. Of course, they gave me options for starting now, but, well, I wanted to enjoy my freedom before becoming their number one student for the next 5 years of my life.
The fresh picture came and Jess hovered. Suddenly realising he needed to pay up, he counted out his coins within his cloak in a conspiratorial way. There's no need for that. This is the borough of Flarick. Much less in the way of thieving and brawls. She knew better than to laugh at him, but Dempsey had always been quite unworldly. Added to that, he was now all alone in the world and probably carrying everything he owned on him. I know I put this in letters, but he was hunched over his drink and she felt his back go as stiff as a board under her hand. I miss her terribly. It must be unbearable for you to be without her. The silence seemed to seep out of him and dampen the diners around them. She'd be so proud.
I'm leaving tomorrow.
The words were like a heavy clink, a lock snapping, a warning. I have all this time now, I wish to intimidate you on my first day with what I can learn from the world. Never underestimate life experience, Fia. When she smiled at him, he looked away and focused on the bottom of the mug he was draining. I chatted up the woman at the steward's hall. She told me about something out west. Not up on the boards yet. Pays good, and it's just the kind of thing that would... Well, people need to know who I... He drank again and filled the cup. Dempsey. Come on, let's enjoy tonight, Fia. All this chat. Tomorrow is the first day I go off and make my name. Celebrate my last day as a know-nothing son of someone. The night was long and full of laughter. They swaggered from pub to pub, heckling bards when they didn't know the ballad of the maiden Gadael, and sang it loudly to the cobblestone hills of the city. When the ale threatened to come back up, they shared a baked apple from a street cellar and looked up at the stars from the city walls. You don't have to prove anything, Dempsey. Not to anyone, she slurred out while fumbling with her dark hair escaping from her comb and discovered it had caramel on it somehow. People like us always are going to feel like we have to live up to some invisible standard. She willed her drunken eyes to focus on his face, but she could not do it and stay balanced on the top of the wall. I spoke ill of the Wanderers to Lady Lightlow. Eesh. She bit again into the soft, sweet apple and used her sleeve to wipe the caramel from her chin. You have to know that Lady Lightlow loves them. I heard she considers one of them actual family. You're lucky she still let you in. You must have really wowed her because last year I saw her tear a new one into someone in my year after they said that Wolfgang was a short king. Ugh, he probably is. Who cares anyway? People behave like they're the only heroes that existed in the last 50 years. He's got to be over 6 foot for sure. Some say he has giant's blood.
But none of the stories mentioned that, not the credible ones. Plenty of heroes got us here, but no, all they remember is the Wanderers. Mother was a part of 5 different groups in her career. One of them was with your father, of course, but just because none of them were the Wanderers, her name is already forgotten. It's not true. It is. We couldn't find anyone who remembered her songs to Night Fear. No one. Bart's a faddy. I'll be sorry, he mumbled to himself. Who will? She crooked her knee on the wall so she could see his face better. No one. He turned and smiled at her and took a deep breath when the moonlight made her amber eyes glow. Something about the night had always made her distant oceanic heritage shimmer out, pale skin replying to the draw of the moon. Even drunk as she was, she smiled back and raised one eyebrow. Aren't you gonna kiss me, Dempsey Gadael? I know you've always wanted to since we were kids. He had. They had sat in the branches of that weeping willow and talked bitterly about absent parents, and he had dreamed of kissing her and wrapping tendrils of her black hair around his fingers. He denied his fingers' request to caress her rosy skin, postponed the revelation that would be the smell of the nape of her neck. How did you get so sticky? Was all he could say. She grinned crookedly, and there was a piece of apple in her teeth. They did not kiss that night, but they did laugh, at themselves and at the world, and they held hands as they walked through the streets, and he helped her onto her horse and watched her ride back to the Exerin Tower, to her room, where she would sleep and wake tomorrow and go to class, and little by little leave him behind. When the sun was high enough to bounce light from the puddles in the road that led out of Ellenthir, Dempsey was already riding east and turning his shoulder to the last few terrible days. The truth was that the first night he lodged in the city, he had been robbed while sleeping in a cheap inn. Every penny of the money he had earned from the house was gone. He was left with only 30 gold pieces that he had secreted about himself: shoes, cloak lining, trouser fastenings. He had spent 22 of that on a grey mare with a simple tan saddle and tack. Much of the rest had gone on board and his night with Fia. He had some dry, curled slices of beef wrapped in his bag, a clay bottle of night slip for the road, and a mission in the Cladmere Basin, just a few days' ride from here. By luck, after he sent Diophea on her horse last night, he had found someone passed out in an icy gutter and stolen his short sword from his side. He hadn't wanted to see if the man had anything else on him, for chance there was something in his pockets that made him real to Dempsey and impossible to steal from. A letter from a loved one, a picture of someone he loved, a to-do list. So he took the sword with its dull edge and close to rotten leather bindings on the hilt and ran. As he passed a flint farmstead, one of the many tending to the lavender-coloured winter barley that covered Dawn Vale this time of year, some children were playing in the muddy track. "Mother, mother, what do you say? Are the woods still safe from the Fae?" They clapped their hands together in a well-known routine that Dempsey used to do himself as a boy. "Well, child, sweet child, listen and think. Run straight home when the moss turns pink. Father, father, is this true? What then if the grass turns blue? No, child, stop, child, take good heed. Rosy water drowns young reeds." He smiled and sang along in a mock theatrical voice as he passed, and the children jumped up and down as they played. He noticed they ran along the stone wall behind him for a little while, until they grew tired and walked back, slapping the heads of cow parsley as they went. High Caledon was far enough north in Dawn Vale that even in the summer months ground frost was common and crop yields were low. But winter barley grew in abundance, and this year was no different. The tough stalks swayed gently in the north wind, and occasionally workers could be seen struggling with scythes to harvest it. This place was forever bitterly cold, and Dempsey cursed it. Where he had grown up in the south, the climate rarely got this cold. He barely had a single hour in the last few weeks where he had felt his fingertips. He would have to take jobs next that would bring him to Annandale or Dimdale or even Odon, where winters were more bearable. After all, there was danger everywhere. The first night, Dempsey slept in a barn, but was chased out at dawn by an angry farmer. The second night, he nursed an ale all evening in an unnamed tavern at a crossroads and attempted to chat up the plump barmaid in the hopes he could share her bed. But she was not interested in his advances, no doubt hardened by many previous attempts by travellers to take a tumble with her. He did manage to get further information about his quarry, though. All he had learned from the steward's hall in Ellenthir was that there was a village in the marsh region known as the Chladmere Basin, where 20 people had gone missing. The rumour was that some entity had made a home in the swamp and was picking off townspeople. The barmaid told him that they had all made poppets to Panlar for protection and endurance, but last anyone had heard from the village was 6 days ago. His mother had told him growing up that often these rumours came from villagers being hysterical in their isolation over winter, and that most things could be chalked up to misadventure or plain old murder. People were quick to shout witch when somebody killed their abusive spouse, but the steward's hall paid up no matter if you brought in a murderer or the head of some harpy. Dempsey would traverse the basin as best he could and then investigate the village. He would be firm but fair with the simple folk and let them feel heard. No doubt they were hysterical with fear by now, and he would be strong for them, and no one would guess that he was barely out of his adolescent years. He would nod sagely and head off in the direction that they pointed. He would be careful and clever, watching and learning, and he would set a trap for the monster and avoid any direct fighting at all. Of course, when he told the story, he would talk of how his sword glowed with the might of the Dark Mother Okrath, and how he beheaded the foul beast with a single mighty slash. If he was going to become so famous that the Exor Tower would have to beg him to come back, he must start weaving his legend right away. On the third day, he entered the basin, and the ground grew softer and softer under hoof. The trees became dark and bare. He pulled his cloak close around him, but the cold and wet had got into his very soul. He thought all day how he wished he'd kissed Hyafia that night. She was tipsy, and he always imagined their first kiss to be different. But if he just knew what the taste of her lips was like, he might not mind the cold so much. They had been flirting around each other for years, and when they dreamed together of their future, fighting evil and being greater than their hero parents, he'd always imagined of them holding hands as they ran into the fray. When she smiled, oblivious to his deception, he'd had to look away. She'd always had a disarming smile, wide and toothful and hiding nothing. He had been pushing back thoughts of his mother, just as he had for 41 days since he was told of her death. But she was creeping closer. These long days, so alone but for the soft, thopping song that the horse's hooves made in the mire. She was a spectre of grief, testing the boundaries of his mind, trying to find a way in. Darting from one soggy, leafless branch to another damp, dead tree stump. When the quiet and the cold lulled him into a lonely stupor, she would find her way in. A young, chubby hand, tracing the patterns on her skin, left by years of magic bursting out of her. Her back, as she rinsed breakfast plates, and feeling waves of motherly disappointment. The light, refracting from a crystal, dancing across her brow. Dempsey trumpeted thoughts that would banish these images, a parade of rational convictions with tambourines and whistles. Speak kindly to the townsfolk, listen and be clever, set a trap, win the day. Grief. skittered back to the shadows of the swamp. As the sun set on the third day, a pack of wolves surrounded him, and he had to leave his sweet horse to them so that he could run. The failing light led him off the path, and wading dangerously through thick tar-like bog, he found a ruined, mouldering shack and cried himself to sleep, and woke to the mud on his legs, crusted and foul-smelling. He stood and scraped the worst of it with his broken fingernails, and then began the walk through the marshes to the village. The land was boggy enough now that the path was a raised wooden byway, narrow and treacherously slimy. He hoped that the day would let him dry out enough to brush the mud from him. He wanted to present himself to the town as a gallant defender, and this fetid, lanky form would instill no confidence. But the air was heavy and sodden and smelled oiled and clingy. When he found the village, it was empty. Stepping quietly and gingerly along the single track, with cottages on either side, doors swung and clattered on their hinges, a great fear had hold of his chest, and he found he could not call out. So he slipped from house to house, looking for a single living soul, to no avail. He thought of how he would tell this story when he returned triumphant, how he could have given way to despair, but he chose to look on the bright side. He had his pick of little houses, larders still stocked, and beds with fur blankets. Tonight he would fill his belly and sleep in a warm bed, and tomorrow he would track the missing people and lay a clever snare for a monster. Stewards' halls paid well enough for hag heads, he knew. Maybe he could earn back the stolen 300 and buy a new pony and find lodgings south of this cheerless place. On the 5th day, he set about the outskirts of the town, pushing into the swampland, looking for clues. A thick mist clung to the ground, and it wasn't long before he wished he'd stuck to the wooden pathway. At first, he kept his sword in his hand for safety, but the path was difficult and he stumbled a few times, nearly impaling himself, so he tucked it into his belt and used his arms for balance. As the sun rose and glinted off the water through the fog, Dempsey was sure his eyes were playing tricks on him. The reflections burned dots in his eyes and made the water appear to have patches of colour on the surface, like lamp oil in a puddle. He waded on through the quagmire. He would not turn back now. He would not fail again. He found items in the bog, a pinafore caught on some brambles, a bonnet floating in water. He knew he was on the right track. He must stay quiet and vigilant so that he would see trouble before it saw him. At times, he would feel something brush against his leg and he would run, knees high, to a patch of high ground. Other times, he would stand still and close his eyes, resting them from the strange glimmers on the surface of the water, and listen to the sounds around him. By the time the sun passed its zenith and began to move west, Dempsey could deny it no longer. The water was laced with streaks of deep pink. Take good heed, rosy water drowns young reeds, he whispered to no one as he swirled his fingers through the sticky residue. It smelt of sweet rotten plums. It had been a day since he'd heard the sound of a bird song, and a few hours since he heard the croak of a frog. The sound of his own breathing had been his only company for some time. So when something broke the surface of the water and rushed at him, the roar was deafening. Long, webbed hands grasped at the top of his thighs, and something unseen yanked at his feet from under him, sent him toppling backwards into the bog. Dempsey twisted and stretched his arms out to find a rock or hard land to pull himself free. Their grip was firmer, though, and his head was submerged in the freezing, inky water. He dug his fingers into the silt and dragged with all his strength, and for a moment his head broke the surface again. He gasped for air and turned to glimpse a rotten, black-eyed face clawing up its way up his torso, smiling with yellow teeth, thin and long like a cone. In a second he remembered himself and drew his sword, cutting his belt with the action, and slashed wildly at the thin creature. The tip of the blade nicked the taut flesh of the creature's forearm, and it screamed out in pain and sank back down, whimpering into the deep. But before Dempsey could scramble away to safety, a second set of arms caught him. Longer still, the elbows clenched tight at his waist, and the forearms wrapped around and up his back, and horrifying hands closed in on the back of his head. Dempsey screamed out. He screamed to the fading sunlight, to the desolate bog. He screamed to Fear and Lady Lightlow, warm in the Exeter Tower, and to his mother who had left him. He kicked out at the creature, dragging him down under the surface of the water that extinguished his screams. He had lost his shoes somewhere along the way, was the thought that came to him. His socked feet paddled pathetically against the deep green flesh of the creature's body. But it had tight hold of him, and it drew him near. He looked through the murky water and made out a bony face, round and creased with gills under the high cheekbones. Black hair bloomed out from her head, and he thought one last time of Fear and her beautiful curls. This hag wrapped her thin legs around his and loosened one arm to stroke a long finger down his cheek. The shock of the gentleness in that touch pulled precious air bubbles from his mouth, and he looked to the surface of the water, the sharp black angles of barren tree branches against the pinking sky. That long hand gently pulled his face away from the vision of the surface. Little Wren, put another log on the fire and let me tell you the story of the basmalish. His mother smelt of the pie she had made that day, stuffed with potatoes, cheese and rosemary. Her hands, covered in spiralling arcane markings, lifted him to her lap. In the old tongue, it means the sweet death, and it is a terrible monster in the northern swamps. Now, don't be scared, my little wren. We live many, many miles away from those swamps. But it is said that the basmalish were once beautiful fey women, spurned and cursed and thrown from the magnificent world of the fey into our world to suffer in the bogs of the coldest and slimiest places in Dawn Valon. These fey become hags, twisted and foul, and slide around the silty floors waiting for travellers to wander through the bogs when they can pull them beneath the water. She sprang on her son and tickled his child's body as he squealed in delight. But do you know something, my sweet boy? A secret that only people like me know. People who make a living of knowing every horrid thing this land has to offer. The basmalish are called the sweet death for a reason. When they capture someone particularly lovely, they don't eat them. No. When they find someone they really like, they draw them under the water and they kiss them. And with that kiss, every pain and woe the wandering victim has ever felt melts away. It's the lingering fey magic, you see. With their kiss, they make them one of their own. Your eyes turn black and your skin turns green, and you never breathe air again, but you live in the water with your new swampy lover, with no fear or care for the cold. No, don't cry, my little wren. The basmalish can't hurt you here. Who knows if it's even a true story? After all, who would tell the tale? It's just a story, my little wren. As the black-eyed woman pressed her lips to his and let the water rush into his mouth, Dempsey felt the imagined smell of rosemary fade away. He forgot all about Diafear's wonderful black hair, and the cup of tea with daisies on them, and the weeping willow by the pond, and the sound of a log cracking on the fire. His broken, grieving heart quieted in his chest, and the spectre of his mother shrank away forever. For Dempsey Gadael's life ended in that swamp on a cold, bright day in midwinter. His hazel eyes became black, and his freckled skin melted to green. His teeth fell out and were replaced by thin, claw-like fangs, and he never left the Lladmere Basin. After some time, Diafear asked for him at the steward's hall,
and found that he'd never returned. She confided her fears to Lady Lightlow, who told the truth of their meeting. And with the help of Lady Lightlow, Diophea took some of her fellow students west to try and find him. But she never did. And that is a story of another life for another day.